Homestead. We know you first from the tour you gave during America's Summer Road Trip, summer before last.
Yeah, Lee. Well, thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, I was very happy that myself and the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum could be part of America's Summer Road Trip, the online video tour. So I had gotten involved with the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum many years ago when I was a high schooler. That was my first summer job when I was in high school. Was one of the tour guides at the front table. And so ever since that, I have been interested in that story in particular, as well as just being interested in local history. I live in Danvers, what used to be Salem Village, and so it is all around me.
Well, that's great. I know from serving on my own local historical society, we and I think this is the case generally across the country. Bemoan, right, the lack of participation by younger folks. You look around the board table, right, it's 50, 60, 70. So that's great that you were a part of that organization as a younger man. And what kind of compelled you to write the book?
Well, I gave that some real thought as to what I wanted my project to be. When I was in graduate school, I studied contemporary Europe, post-war Europe, so not colonial America. And the reason I thought that this book needed to be written is because of my involvement with the museum. When one visits a museum, a historical site of significance, pretty much anywhere in America, there's always either a biography of the person who lived there, several books about that main event. For example, if you go to Mount Vernon, I mean, think about how many biographies of George Washington you could find there.
Let me interrupt for just a second and welcome folks. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of the Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. Joining us tonight is Daniel Gagnon. Dan serves on the board of directors of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum in Danvers, Massachusetts, formerly known as Salem Village. He is a high school history teacher on the North Shore. He received his bachelor's in history from Providence College and his master's in history from Boston College. Dan led a tour of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum for America's Summer Road Trip last year, and we'll put a link to that in the chat for you to watch later. He's joining us tonight to discuss his new book, A Salem Witch, The Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dan.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
And Dan, you know what? Let's do this. Let's actually kind of set the stage, and then we'll come back later, and you can talk to us more about kind of what prompted you to put all this hard work into actually writing this book. So what was going on, what had gone on in the past in terms of witchcraft, both in North America, in Europe, and so forth? Was this something that sprang up in Salem, or is this something that has a much longer history?
I think that is a really important place for us to start. As we in the United States, when we do think of so-called witchcraft, witch trials, witch accusations, Salem is what comes to mind first, and there's a good reason for that, but it certainly does not begin in colonial America by any means. In fact, the largest witch hunts and series of witch trials are European. In northern France, in the German states at that point in time, and also there are many in England, which would have most influenced the New England colonists. But this is a unfortunate but long-standing series of events, and this was widespread in Protestant areas of Europe, Catholic areas of Europe since the Reformation, in Protestant England with the Anglican Church as well. So within these different traditions, there's still some version of witch hunts that do occur.
And was this the first occurrence in North America, in the colonies?
It is not. There were several other instances in Massachusetts during the 1600s from 1620 up until 1692 when the Salem witch hunt begins. They were very different, though, than Salem. And there were also instances in Connecticut as well and elsewhere in New England. But all of these previous incidents were very small. It would be one person accused, maybe just a handful of people accused. And so Salem is what really comes to our mind, in that during the Salem witch hunt, from, we could say it begins the end of January 1692 through to October of that year, not a long period of time, we have more than 185 people accused. We know 185 names in the records, and it's always presumed to be more. Oftentimes people say about 200. So the scale is just entirely different.
Let's again, in terms of providing context here, let's touch on something else before we get into Rebecca's story in particular. How widespread was the belief in witches and witchcraft?
So this belief was incredibly widespread. It's very easy for us here, talking through the computer in the 21st century, to be very dismissive of beliefs of prior generations, of in some cases even prior nations here. But this is not a belief that was just relegated to those who might be less educated, those who lived outside of major cities. By no means. Kings, queens believe in witchcraft. James I of England is a huge proponent of this, of hunting for witches in England. We have professors at Oxford University who espouse this belief almost uniformly. In fact, I have one example in the book of, there's one gentleman at Oxford, a professor, who writes a tract skeptical that witchcraft was real. And he's thrown out of his job at Oxford as a professor because he's a skeptic of it. That's how deeply rooted it was, that to question it as an intellectual, people just couldn't believe that that was something you could question. It was just taken for granted.
That's very helpful and so difficult for us to understand today, as you said. So how did this get started in Salem, and then take us to the point at which Rebecca is accused?
So Rebecca Nurse will be accused in March of 1692, and the events of the witch hunt itself really begin at the end of January that year, so several weeks beforehand. The way it begins is it's in the minister's household. Reverend Samuel Parris is the minister of Salem Village. He had been there only a couple of years, since 1689. When he arrived in 1689, he was seen as a real positive change and a hope that he would bring stability to the little Salem Village church. The previous ministers had all either really quit and left in a huff, or had been almost driven from their post and not paid by the village. It had been really acrimonious. And so what we have is this backdrop of, it seems like the community is finally going to be stable. And this is, of course, the furthest thing from the truth as to what happens. So in his home that January, he lived with his wife. He lived with two enslaved people who were indigenous, we believe, to the Caribbean or possibly Central America. We were not entirely clear, unfortunately, named Tituba and John Indian. And then he has a few young children. The two that will be most prominent are Betty Parris, who's about 9, and then his adopted niece, Abigail Williams, who's around 11. And these two, Betty and Abigail, begin to be unwell, frighteningly unwell, rolling on the floor, screaming, convulsing, as if it's some sort of seizure. And then it goes on to, they will crawl around on the floor on all fours, make animal noises. At one point, Abigail will try to run into a fireplace and up the chimney while a fire is lit. This behavior that was shocking to their parents. And when this begins, Reverend Parris, as the witch hunt goes on, gets a bad reputation in that he is a supporter of the witch hunt and will testify against people in his own congregation. And that reputation for those reasons is deserved. But at the beginning, he tries to keep everything quiet. It doesn't seem as though he's masterminding this in any sort of way. He appears embarrassed in the way that he writes in his notes that he wanted to keep it quiet. He only tells his friends. And other ministers come by that he will ask their opinions on the situation. But soon it spreads. And then you have teenage young women, and then young women in their single women, but in their early 20s, all across Salem Village that start to act similarly within a few weeks. At that point, the whole village knows that this is going on. It can't be kept quiet. They're going to bring in several doctors. And one doctor, it's assumed to be the Salem Village doctor, but we don't actually know this for sure, which doctor. But one of these doctors says that they're under, quote, an evil hand, meaning it's witchcraft. Once he says that, the situation really changes. The Puritan belief in witchcraft is if this is happening to somebody, someone else has to be doing it. And so it really transitions from a situation where it seemed innocent, unfortunate, but innocent. Probably appeared to them as some sort of unexplained regular illness, in which case nobody's at fault. It's just an illness. But once he says an evil hand, they then feel that they need to find who is doing it. And that's really when the witch hunt part begins. The first couple accused before Rebecca Nurse, they all have something in their background that, unfortunately, and from the Puritans' perspective, would have cast suspicion upon them. There are things that, of course, us looking back on this today, we would not have this perspective. But from the Puritan perspective, and so the first accused is going to be Tituba, the slave who lived in Reverend Parris's household. The reason she's accused, the most probably persuasive reason, is that she lived in that house where it all first started. So proximity would be suspicious, but also she's an indigenous person, not originally a Puritan. She's one of the few slaves in Salem Village. For these reasons, she really probably would have seemed an outsider to that community. After her, they accused two women from Salem Village, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good was essentially a beggar. She had been periodically homeless. She'd been known to mutter against people if they didn't give her alms, which was one thing. But once witchcraft accusations are going around, suddenly one would think to themselves, what was she muttering against me? These ordinary things seem suspicious. And then Sarah Osborne had not gotten along well with her family. Her husband had passed away, and she remarried a little too quickly, perhaps, for the Puritan perspective, and to the servant who lived in their household. So that would have been suspicious. And then there's Martha Corey, who lived in what is today the city of Peabody, so south of Salem Village. And her family, particularly her husband, had a real cantankerous reputation in the village and in Salem town. And then it's Rebecca Nurse. In March 1692, a pious elderly woman at 71, important member of the church. And her case, one reason, there's many reasons, but one reason I think her case is so significant is even by the standards of their day, never mind ours, but the standards of their day, so unlikely of a person to be accused of witchcraft.
So talk to us about what happened, and let's focus on her. Who came forward? What was the proof or the evidence, and what was the process?
Yes, so it was the end of February will be when her name is first mentioned by some of these afflicted accusers, as they're called, those who are having these fits, seizure-like fits. And in Rebecca Nurse's case in particular, early on and really throughout the spring, her two primary accusers are actually a mother and daughter. It's Ann Putnam Sr. and Ann Putnam Jr. They have the same name, which can be confusing to keep track of. And what we have is that Ann Putnam Jr. has a series of fits in her home, and they live a good distance from the Nurse family's farm. It's not that they're immediate neighbors. They're pretty much the other side of Salem Village. And what she'll say is that she, in her fits, she sees specters, which they believed were ghostly images of the witch, allegedly, or an image that the alleged witch had sent to them, like it could be an animal that allegedly the witch had sent to them. And so she says that she sees a specter of an older woman and doesn't know her name. And she describes this, and from the record, it's almost not clear that she's even really accusing Rebecca Nurse initially. And then those in her household will suggest names. And somebody, going off of where she recognized this woman, she knew she sat so-and-so place in the meeting house every Sunday, and putting it together, someone else suggests Rebecca Nurse's name. And from there on out, Aunt Putnam Jr. uses Rebecca Nurse's name for this thing that she claims that she's seen. But it's not even really her who first accuses her exactly. And from there on out, her mother, Aunt Putnam Sr., will claim that Rebecca Nurse is afflicting her, which is the word for using witchcraft against somebody. Ann Putnam's mother has real dramatic scenes. Oftentimes when there is a witness, a guest to their home, who records this, that Rebecca Nurse's specter, her image, appears to her in the bedroom, and they will argue about Bible verses. And Ann Putnam Sr. claims that she, tells Rebecca Nurse that she's been cast out and that she will never, see heaven once her life is over. And beyond that, we're going to get sorts of physical evidence as well. With these early claims of apparitions, of spectral images, and this claim that they're being harmed, by no means is this any sort of, hard evidence in the least. With Rebecca Nurse, we kind of start to see the beginning of more alleged physical evidence compared to some of those others who were accused prior. Maybe because accusing Rebecca Nurse is, quite frankly, a harder sell, being a very respected woman in the community. And Ann Putnam Jr. will claim that she sees specters, and the specters whip her with chains, that Rebecca Nurse's image is whipping her with chains, and then come forward and show on her arm like circles as if that was evidence of her being hit with a chain, which is fascinating in that those marks don't just get there. Something is pressed up against her arm, intentionally, unintentionally, whether it's just her, whether it's conspiring with other accusers, but something is done there to claim that it's evidence. And we'll see more and more of that. There's one example where people are seen, one woman in particular is seen taking a pin out of her dress, stabbing herself, and then as she's bleeding, claiming it was Rebecca Nurse's specter that did it. This is the kind of physical evidence that is, of course, fraudulent and untrue.
Is there any possible motivation here, either as a way to excuse one's own behavior, shortcomings, or attract attention or sympathy, or because of animus toward Rebecca Nurse?
Well, that is an interesting question, and I think it's interesting, particularly in Rebecca Nurse's case. There will be some individuals accused during the witch hunt that we can see in the background that one family may not have gotten along with another family, that there could have been these, petty disputes, human frailties that lead to bad blood. And we don't see that with Rebecca Nurse. We really do not. When she's accused, those who live on the surrounding farms, her neighbors, support her. It's not a little neighborhood dispute in that sense. It had often been written in some really early histories that Rebecca Nurse had not gotten along well with the Putnam family, that Mrs. Ann Putnam and her daughter Ann Putnam and company. In looking further, there really seems to be very little connection. Thinking back even to just Ann Putnam didn't even know her name. Clearly not a significant figure in their family life then. They lived very far away. They had no sort of land dispute, as had been claimed erroneously in some really early 19th century books. We really don't see a motive. Not that we can ever really understand any of these motives, as an accusation was meant to lead towards death. And so even these petty disputes, one cannot imagine that one would escalate that to an accusation that would essentially be murder, that would lead to someone's death. But with Rebecca Nurse in particular, well-respected, pillar of the community. She had lived in either Salem town or Salem village since the 1630s, that we really don't see anything in her background. And that's why she's such a contrast to those first few who were accused, that although it might not be a good reason, to the Puritans, there would have been some sort of reason to accuse those.
And so what happened to the women who had been accused before her? And then what was the process? What was the sequence of events once she was ultimately accused?
Yes, so those who were accused prior to her, once one was accused of a crime in colonial Massachusetts, somebody had to go to the judge and essentially fill out a form. There was the formal accusation, and then you'd be arrested. You'd be brought before the two local magistrates, depending on which towns you lived in and what region. You had different ones. You'd be brought before them, and you'd have a hearing. And what it was is, it's not exactly an arraignment as we would do today, but you can kind of think of what one might see on the nightly news. Someone first arrested as their first appearance before a judge, and the only decision is there enough evidence to hold you for a trial or not? They will hold everybody for trial in 1692, with the exception of one person who they actually just genuinely arrested the wrong guy. Like, they got the name wrong. But other than that, the judges always determined that there was enough evidence to hold them for trial. So these women before Rebecca Nurse were in jail, awaiting a trial that they did not know when it would arrive. So when Rebecca Nurse is arrested, she's arrested at home at the Nurse Homestead. She's brought to the tavern in the center of Salem Village, and her initial hearing doesn't occur there. What happened really early on is that with these initial hearings, a lot of people want to go watch. And so the tavern's too small. It's moved to the big meeting house, which is really the only public building in Salem Village. It's all just farmsteads. And so she is examined, as they called it, but it's her hearing, in the meeting house. She's brought before John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, the two local magistrates. The meeting house is packed full of her neighbors, family, friends, accusers, this whole mix. And all of her accusers up to that point, we do believe, are present. We have most of them written down as being there. And while the judges question Rebecca Nurse, the accusers do not keep quiet by any means. They, at certain phrases she says, fall into their fits, screaming, flailing in front of the judges, pointing that they claim that they see specters of her, like her image, also image of like animals in the meeting house. It really sounds chaotic from this description. Questions are interrupted. You can see in one, I think, particularly fascinating angle, that some of these fits occur when the judges almost seem to be letting up a little bit, going a little softer on Rebecca Nurse. There's several points where it seems like John Hathorne, and with the record, we believe that it is John Hathorne who asked all the questions. It doesn't actually have his name next to it, but we believe that he asked the questions. That he goes from hardline questions, and when Rebecca Nurse gives her answers, claiming her innocence, claiming to know nothing of witchcraft, he will begin the next question, as a hypothetical. Supposing you are innocent, and that's when the fits occur. As soon as it seems like the hardline questions are letting up, and that seems convenient, to say the least.
Just to add a little more color to this, you said the meeting house, is this packed? Is this almost everyone in town? How many people are in this meeting house?
So the meeting house itself, with Rebecca Nurse's examination in particular, we don't quite have a full number, but these, as that spring continues, and really from the get-go here, They're packed to the point that people are outside, standing in doorways, looking through windows. The meeting house would have fit just a couple hundred people. We think Salem Village had approximately 400 people. That is very much an estimate. And so you would have had most of Salem Village and people from surrounding towns come in. Once the first few examinations happened, word spread of what was happening in Salem Village. People were frightened and fascinated. People come from pretty far. As the spring goes on, people will come from Charlestown, now part of Boston. People will come from way out in Gloucester, way out around the ocean there to Salem Village. Long journeys to see this. So it is packed. And yeah, probably everybody she knew would have been in that building.
And so this examination, how long does it last and what's the outcome?
We don't have a real amount of time, but it's pretty lengthy. She is questioned for quite a while. Some of the questions are repetitive. Some of them are more innovative in looking at different angles. There's the assumption from the beginning, though, that she's guilty. The judges are asking the questions, assuming that it's true.
And Dan, just to interrupt for just a second. So there was a detailed trial record?
Yeah, so we actually have a better record of her initial hearing than we do of her trial itself. For her hearing, they would always appoint a clerk to take notes. In this case, the clerk is Reverend Samuel Parris. So the record is in his writing, and he writes down question, answer, with some notes in between, couldn't quite hear what was saying. I'm paraphrasing here, but couldn't quite hear what was saying because of the tumultuous room, because of these fits that interrupt, and he sitting near the judges, he can't even hear what's going on, which shows you how chaotic it is.
So at the end of the examination, the opinion is she needs to be held. She goes to jail, and not that is ever, but jail's a pretty horrible place, especially then, correct?
Most certainly, yes. So she is held. The two judges do deem that there's enough credible evidence to them to hold her for a future trial at an unknown date. She will be taken to the jail in downtown Salem, and it is miserable. It's cramped, it's muddy. Not all the mud comes from water, let's just say, not having facilities in there, which leads to disease. People will be dehydrated, truly ill. There's rats. It is grimy and gross. And throughout the witch hunt, we're going to have at least 5 people who will die in these various jails because the conditions are so awful.
And how old is she again at this juncture?
She is 71.
That's amazing. This must have really taken a huge toll emotionally and physically. How long is she in that jail?
So she will be in the Salem jail for just a few weeks, and then she's sent to the Boston jail in mid-April, and she'll be there until the end of May, about a month and a half, then back to the Salem jail in June. And she's sent back to the Salem jail in June, as this is when they start to begin the grand jury sessions, which then lead to the trials. And they decide to do that. It had been assumed they would do it in Boston, which is where most capital cases were tried. But since everybody was from around the Salem area, they decided it's easier to do it in the townhouse in Salem. So that's when she's sent back to the Salem jail, and she will be in there throughout the month of June, halfway through July, and that's the point that she will be executed for witchcraft.
And so I'm sorry, in that sequence of events, the trial and the duration of the trial?
So it's in the month of June. The court meets in sessions with little gaps between them. And so in the session in early June, she goes before the grand jury, which is a similar step to the hearing in the sense that all it is deciding, is there enough evidence to go on trial? That's their determination. The difference there is it's not just 2 judges, but you have 18 jurors. Allegedly a jury of one's peers. It is, of course, all men. And they need to endorse a charge before you go to trial.
And is that a majority, or does it need to be unanimous?
It would have been a majority. And so what we come out with here is that at the trial, her jury does need to be unanimous as it would be today to convict.
And so talk to us about the trial. To what extent was she represented? To what extent was she, what role did she play in the trial?
Yes. So on the one hand, the framework of the trial is broadly familiar to us. It's an adversarial trial. It's a lawyer for the prosecutor. You have a jury of 12 men who are the ones who make the decision. You have a judge up front, though in this case, instead of one, the court that's set up has a panel of judges. One significant difference, though, is there is no defense lawyer for Rebecca Nurse.
And was that common based on the legal system at that point, or was that peculiar in some way because she was accused of witchcraft?
No, it was commonplace. Defense lawyers were not done, neither in England nor in the English colonies. The theory was that you had the prosecutor arguing the government's case or their majesty's case against you, and looking out for the rights of the accused person, the defendant, was supposed to be the judge or judges. They were supposed to make sure that they were given their rights to speak, that the procedure was fair. This, in a general sense, is problematic, but most especially for a trial such as this, a witch trial, as those who are the judges of the court are very much all in on the witch hunt, with only one exception. There's one individual who will quit after the first trial. But especially the Chief Justice, who's the one who gives the instructions to the jury, the one who supervises these trials, he is a firm believer that there are witches there, that they are real, and that this witch hunt is the correct course. So he cannot be trusted to be looking out for the rights of the defendant.
Yeah, based on what you described earlier, the situation at Oxford, it sounds like his position in the community would be in jeopardy if he in some way cast doubt upon the presence of witches.
Yes, and what we see in terms of those who will become skeptical of the witch hunt as it continues, we don't see any denials that witchcraft is real. The only skepticism we'll see are in certain cases, and really they have issues with this process, but not skepticism that, yes, theoretically witchcraft is real. We don't see that challenged.
And so how long does the trial last? And is it somewhat along the lines of the examination, or were there some new aspects to this proceeding?
So definitely new aspects. It's not the judges who are asking questions of her. What will occur? Oh, and so as to the time, there are a few done that day. So we don't exactly know the time, but we imagine a couple hours thereabouts to occur during the day. And what we see is that the prosecution will bring witnesses. Some we have as written testimony, but they would have actually gone to the trial and their testimony would have been read out loud. They would swear to it up front that it was the truth, and then leave or take their seats in the audience. And so the prosecution goes through this, witnesses after witnesses. We have Putnam Jr., who is an important focal point. Many of those other early accusers do join Putnam and Putnam in their accusations against Nurse. We see Reverend Paris testifying against Rebecca Nurse, which is significant. And he will testify. He's brought in as a witness to other people's fits. He himself never claimed that anyone was doing witchcraft to him, but he's around when his daughter has fits, when his niece has fits. He's invited over to witness other people's fits. And so he's kind of brought in as a witness just to what he saw, but he goes a lot further. He will use phrases, again, as a paraphrase, not that he saw somebody have a fit, but he will testify that he saw witchcraft done to them. Well, how could he know that? All he can see is the reaction. but his testimony assumes that that is real. And so once the prosecution brings their witnesses, then the defense has their turn. We believe it's Rebecca Nurse's husband who manages this for her. You could have somebody help you come up with witnesses. It couldn't be a lawyer, but they could help you come up with witnesses because she was in jail and could never prepare any sort of defense for herself.
Was she at the trial?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So she would have been right down front.
And again, the trial itself lasted
a few hours, so it seems.
And then at what point? Well, excuse me. Let me go back to witnesses. Were there people who spoke on her behalf that felt like this was unfair and that she had no reason to be accused?
Yes, exactly. She has the most defense evidence, the strongest defense out of any of those who stand trial in 1692. Her family, again, is presumed her husband primarily, or her sons and daughters as well, I'm sure. They really go to work on this defense. Right after she was arrested and sent to jail, they went around to the neighbors with a petition that 39 neighbors signed, saying that they can't imagine, based on her background, that she would be accused of this. And then one other neighbor, Putnam actually, who is a uncle to the Ann Putnams, he sends in a piece of paper that's the exact same language as the petition. He doesn't sign that paper, but he signs to the same sentiment. Others are brought in to be witnesses at the trial in addition to the petition. They will testify that they've never known Rebecca Nurse in any way to be involved with any sort of thing such as this. They'll testify to her good character in raising her children, who've become important members of the church, and that would reflect upon her positively. They will also bring in defense witnesses who question the credibility of the accusers. That is a significant impact. They will reveal several women to be known liars, is essentially what it comes down to. There's one in particular that they testify that years and years prior, she had pretended to have seizures, totally unrelated to this. But when she's one of the important witnesses of Rebecca Nurse's trial, it conveniently has what looks like seizures then. That's a pretty solid reputation there, that she's known to do this. And that has a lasting impact beyond Rebecca Nurse's case. For example, one of the witnesses, somebody who had come all the way down from Gloucester, testified against Abigail Williams, Reverend Parris's niece, and apparently so discredits her that Reverend Parris will not write any more testimony from her to be used in court against anyone else, that her reputation is so damaged by Rebecca Nurse's family and their defense. So it is significant.
And then at what point was the decision handed down?
So at the end of this phase, the testimony, the judge gives the jury instructions. The Chief Justice gives them instructions that are not great and not what he should have said based on the law. And again, if you're relying on the judge to protect the rights of the defendant, we see here that it's really doing the opposite. From the directions he gives them, the phrasing and what he expects of them greatly increases the chance that the answer will be guilty. He really broadens that in a way that it's not even what they believed exactly that the witchcraft charge was. So despite that, the jury will return the first time and find her not guilty. And this will change. And I don't necessarily want to give away every twist of this moment, but I will say of its significance. In Massachusetts, we had mentioned at the beginning that other people had been accused of witchcraft in ones and twos here and there. There hadn't been, for about 40 years, anyone convicted and executed in Massachusetts for witchcraft. There'll be one exception in 1689. But other than that, from the 1650s to 1692, yeah, people were accused. People were put on trial, but the judges in Massachusetts had real skepticism. Not that witches were real, but that they were proven in court. In 1692, they throw aside all of this skepticism and they go right in. And that is striking in that we have a clear departure from the tradition of skepticism in Massachusetts. And these judges, many were fairly elderly for their day, but were very experienced and had been involved in witch trials previously. These witch trials where they threw out or refused to accept guilty verdicts. So the same people.
They'd previously been more fair, simply, and then something happens here where they're tremendously biased.
Yeah, I suppose more fair, just unwilling to accept guilty verdicts. In the 1650s, there had been one, the wife, or by that point, the widow of another judge and political figure who had been convicted by a jury, and they had not really been comfortable with it at the time. And when this mistake is made, it seems as though, whether a conscious decision or an unconscious decision, that they really don't want to go through that again and have somebody that the judges weren't convinced deserved that to go through it. And so they will really pump the brakes here. It's not that accusations don't happen. It's not that trials don't happen. And there were people executed before that, and a woman in Boston in 1689. But they were surprisingly cautious up until this point, one would think.
Any indication of what caused the change?
Well, it's a huge change. It's significant, and it's in every case here in 1692. So it's much broader than Rebecca Nurse.
Every case in Salem or Salem and beyond?
In Salem. It's not just Rebecca Nurse who has this assumed guilt. In fact, she'd be the least likely to have the assumed guilt. There's several theories. One that I think has some merit for sure is that these judges are also the political leaders of Massachusetts. It's not the governor himself, but the Chief Justice is the deputy governor of Massachusetts. The others are members of the upper house of the legislature. They have responsibility for the situation in Massachusetts. And things are really not going great for the Commonwealth at this point in time. They're losing wars with Native Americans. There had been disease. In addition to fighting the Native Americans, they're fighting the French in Canada. It's really going poorly. And in a certain way, as is argued by some, that this is sort of a way for them not to be blamed for that. There was this belief that witchcraft was tied to the Native Americans. The witchcraft was tied to the French because they were Catholic and not Puritan. To them, that was only one step away from witchcraft. And so they believed that witches would have been the natural allies of their earthly enemies. So when you look at it in the context of this war that's going on, yeah, that seems plausible, that it's, to simplify, it's not their fault they're losing the war. It's a supernatural one.
Well, Dan, this has been so interesting, and as you mentioned, there's much more to the story. I want to bring in Carrie, who has questions from our audience tonight, who's thoroughly enjoying your talk.
Great.
Okay, our first question is about the name. Is Salem Village now Danvers? And if so, when and why was that change made? Was there a connection to the witch trials in that change?
That's a good question. That's a good one to clarify. It's no connection to the witch trials. So Salem at the time was divided. It was one town, but two communities. So Salem Village is what's now Danvers. The lines almost exactly line up. So Danvers. And then you had Salem Town, which is what's today the city of Salem, and most of what's now the city of Peabody. And you had these two areas. So the witch hunt begins in the village, Danvers, which is the farming area. But the actual trials take place in downtown Salem, which had the building for the court. Now, as to the name change, so Salem Village had long wanted to be totally separate from Salem and had tried well before the witch hunt to do that, and it doesn't work until 1752. And at this point in time, finally, it happens. They're granted a district and then they're their own town. And the name Danvers isn't chosen by people who live there. The name is changed simply to avoid confusion. Having two places named Salem would be complicated. And so it's believed that it's named after the family of one of the governors of New York. His name was Danvers Osborne. And it's kind of a classic example of the governor of Massachusetts trying to curry favor with this influential family. And so he names a town after them. That's what most likely seems to have happened.
Okay, great. So when a convicted witch was executed, were the accusers suddenly cured?
Not in all instances, but in some instances, there seems to be a change, whether this is, unconscious or intentional. For example, even not just executed, when Rebecca Nurse is first jailed, in that following week, there seems to be an improvement among those who had accused her and who had been unwell. After she is executed, she's not mentioned as causing their fits and seizures, but they do continue, and they will name other people as causing them. She is still mentioned in certain records, but not as still actively, allegedly doing witchcraft to anyone.
Okay. What is Rebecca's tie to the double jeopardy rule of law?
The double jeopardy. Good. So the idea of double jeopardy is that one cannot be tried twice for the same crime. If you've been acquitted once by the state of Massachusetts can't decide a week later, we're going to try again. It's not how it works. It's unfair. The Constitution forbids double jeopardy. That's an important legal right, and it helps promote fairness in the judicial system. Rebecca Nurse's case is not technically double jeopardy, but it gets us to that same idea and that same problem. I mentioned that at first the jury comes back and says not guilty. Well, knowing that we had mentioned that she was executed, clearly that has changed to guilty at some point, fairly immediately afterwards. And so because it's the same trial, technically might not apply, but the idea is, in its fullest sense, does apply, that once a decision is made, you can't change your decision. She is the only one at that court during the witch trials, the court of Oyer and Terminer, to be returned as not guilty. And so that moment is significant, obviously, for her, but also for that entire court system, for this entire witch hunt. That is an important moment. But yeah, we see several improvements, reforms that'll come out of the witch trials here. Massachusetts will not immediately, but some years later, begin allowing defense counsel. Well, that's a very important change, and they allow that far before England does for most crimes. So they're ahead there. At the end of the witch trials, in November, the Massachusetts legislature will pass laws clarifying what rights people have, such as rights of habeas corpus related to the judicial system and arrest, and similar civil rights involving the court system. They'll even reform what witchcraft is in the law. And this is still that winter following the witch hunt. That'll actually get a veto from London because they provided too many rights to the accused. So there is a significant change based on that. And there is a lesson that is learned here. It is learned in a horrible way, a very hard way, a difficult way, but immediately afterwards, it's seen that improvements are needed.
Okay, thank you. Next question. In general, witchcraft was and persecution was carried out towards women. Do we see in Salem any accusations towards men, and what was kind of the ratio?
So we still see that the Salem witch hunt fits the unfortunate larger trend of predominantly women being on the receiving end of witchcraft accusations. That is a clear trend throughout in the Western world, seemingly every instance. It's to varying degrees, but that is a clear theme. In Salem, it's about 3/4 of the accused who are women. 25% are men. One thing that kind of sets Salem apart is that out of that, they actually go on to execute a high percentage of men. There's going to be 20 who are executed, including Giles Corey, who dies under torture, and we can include him in the executed section. But out of those, there's about 1/3 of them who are men. So more than the 25% who are accused, and definitely more than other instances in colonial New England. So that is a difference.
Okay. All right. So was witchcraft considered a crime against the law as opposed to heresy for, being a church member instead?
So in Massachusetts or in England still, or rather, but especially in Massachusetts, it's a civil crime. It's a felony, just like murder. It's treated as a civil crime. Now, one cannot get past the obvious, not just religious connotation, but religious reasoning behind it. But in Massachusetts, every felony was based on scripture. Thou shalt not kill. Well, murder is a felony. And going on from there. So that is the basis of every crime. But no, it's not a trial by the church. It is a trial by the province of Massachusetts. There are no ministers who are judges. It's lay people who are the judges. One had trained to be a minister, but isn't a minister. And the jury is ordinary people. There's farmers. One guy was brewing beer over in Wenham. He was the foreman of the jury. So it's not ecclesiastical. It's not a church trial.
Okay, perfect. All right, we have a viewer who says, I had read that the rye crop may have been blighted with ergot and could have caused the initial observed behaviors. Is that a possibility?
So this is an important question, and one that frequently comes up. It's particularly one that's still used if one were to watch like TV programs about the witch hunt. It is, however, long discredited. It is not the case. So this theory had come out in the 1970s. It was published in a science journal, and the idea of this ergot poisoning or ergotism is this is a fungus, ergot, and it can grow in damp areas, swampy areas on grain. So rye is really what was grown in large quantities around Salem Village. The belief is, this mold gets on the rye, you grind it into flour, bake it and eat it, and it can make you ill. More than ill, it was compared to hallucinogenic like LSD. Well, at first glance, you have people saying they're seeing animals, specters, being unwell. One can clearly see the idea of pursuing whether there's a connection. But there isn't for a few reasons. First of all, they knew about that back then, and they did call all these doctors from the surrounding towns. Hopefully one of them would have been familiar with that. Also, typically in this, I don't know, choose the word dosage, as if it was a medicine, but with ergotism, the dose would have the strongest effect on the youngest in the family, just because they're smaller. And we have many instances where the afflicted accusers have younger siblings, totally fine. So that doesn't really work. Other parts of it are those who are afflicted are from all over the village. Some live on top of fairly tall hills. Others might live in a swamp. It's not like it's one part of town or anything that this could have happened in. And lastly, with ergotism, the kind that's hallucinogenic causes obvious physical symptoms. Essentially, it's like gangrene. And we have a lot of really wild accusations that happened in 1692, descriptions of totally unbelievable things. We have such great documents. If someone was gangrenous and in the period of that amount of months had like fingers falling off and turning green, someone would have mentioned this. That would have actually been ripe for a witchcraft accusation. So somebody would have mentioned that. And for these reasons, it doesn't fit. And the last reason I would say is there are some instances, like when Rebecca Nurse gets a not guilty verdict, the afflicted immediately have fits. And a physical illness just doesn't happen when it's convenient. That is a clear moment in time where it was useful to them. And so a physical explanation doesn't really work.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's wrap up with just one quick question here. If you are in there, if people are in the area, is the Rebecca Nurse Homestead open for tours? Have they kind of pared back for winter hours?
Good. So yeah, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead is the only home of a victim of the witch hunt that's preserved and open to the public. And so it's important for that reason. There's the memorial to Rebecca Nurse. There's a cemetery, we think, where she's buried. And also George Jacobs, one of those men executed, was reburied there in 1992. So a much more recent event. And so definitely a spot to visit out in Danvers and what was Salem Village. It's not open in the winter months. Being colonial structures, there's no heat. So it's really more of a practical reason, but it opens in the spring, usually the end of April, and is open through the beginning in November.
Okay, perfect. So if you would like to see the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, we are putting a link in the chat to the tour that Dan did for America's Summer Road Trip last summer, and that will give you a good peek and hold you over until you can go visit that when it opens back up when the weather's nice.
Excellent.
So take a look at that. All right, so this has been fascinating, and as always, so much more to unpack in the book. So if you have enjoyed this, make sure to check out that book, and you'll learn so much more about what was happening in the whole community and with Rebecca Nurse in particular. We've got a link to that in the chat as well. And then we know this is such a popular topic, so we've also put a link in the chat to a discussion that we did with Emerson Baker, A Storm of Witchcraft. And we did that a few months ago, so that is in the chat and you can watch that as well. And if you enjoyed this, there are a few things you can do. You can share this with your friends. You can share our emails and our social posts. Make sure you're on our email list. You can sign up at historycamp.org and consider making a small donation to the Pursuit of History. That's the nonprofit that brings these to you every week. Now, next week, of course, is Thanksgiving, so we will not be doing a live broadcast as usual, but we will have two sessions playing for you. At 8 p.m., we will get to hear from Dr. Donna Curtin of the Pilgrim Hall Museum about the Pilgrims' experience when they first arrived. And then at 9 p.m., you will get to hear from Linda Jeffers Coombs, who's a Wampanoag elder, and she is an author and historian. And she is going to tell you about the Wampanoag perspective of the arrival of the Pilgrims. So join us for those and have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, Dan, for spending the evening with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, Dan.
Good night.